Whenever I hear this gospel passage, it reminds me of Pope John Paul II, St. John Paul II, the Pope of Mercy. And he reflected on this passage, and actually in a lot of the encyclicals that John Paul II would write, he would reflect especially on a gospel passage and then draw a lot of spiritual lessons out of it. And so the passage of the prodigal son, or that John Paul II also calls the parable of the merciful father, comes out in his 1980 encyclical, Dives in Misericordia. And one of the things that is always inspiring to me when I read John Paul II is that it's not just a theoretical knowledge. He's sharing things from his own experience. Because here's a man who, in his own life grew up, practically, or he was orphaned little by little, losing first his mom, then his brother, and then his dad in his college years. Then, growing up or living through two totalitarian regimes, coming of age as the Nazis had occupied his country, and then living as a priest, a bishop under, communist rule. And, he writes this encyclical, Dives in Misericordia, in 1980. And it's precisely 6 months later that there's an attempt on his life. Ali Aka shoots and 2 bullets enter John Paul II's body. And he goes through rigorous few days of surgery in order to be able to survive. And it was this, this is perhaps one of the most poignant moments of his papacy. But as soon as he was recovered enough, what did he do? He went to the prison where Ali Aka was being held, and he had a private meeting with him and shared his forgiveness. Not necessarily that the assassin or would-be assassin was hoping for that. So when he writes about mercy, it's not just a theoretical exercise. It's something that he lived out. His years of meditating on the parable of the prodigal son shaped his understanding of God's mercy and influenced his teachings. The gospel passage that we just have read from Luke 15 is one of the most, I would say, powerful writings in all of Western civilization. And if you want to get to know one chapter of the gospel well, I would suggest Luke 15, because we have 3 different parables of God's mercy. The parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost silver coin, and then finally perhaps the masterpiece of Luke, this parable of the prodigal son. And I think it's a challenge to each one of us. Because so often we can come to Mass, we can pray the rosary, we can have moments of adoration, but we don't always live our faith in an experiential way. And I think that the challenge of this gospel passage is to recognize how each one of us is lost and how each one of us is called to conversion. In his encyclical, Pope John Paul II shares, although the word mercy does not appear, it nevertheless expresses the essence of the divine mercy in a particularly clear way. This is due not so much to the terminology as in the Old Testament books, as to the analogy that enables us to understand more fully the very mystery of mercy, as a profound drama played out between the Father's love and the prodigality and sin of the Son. I think another thing, kind of a key to read St. John Paul II is to recognize that during his years in college, he participated in a theater of the word. And so as they'd been, invaded first by the Nazis and then later on by the communists, in order to preserve their Polish culture, they would get together and recite, long passages of Polish poetry or reenact classic dramas. And so a word that you might hear often in John Paul II's writing is precisely that word, drama. But I think here, talking about the parable of the prodigal son, it's so fitting. How many stories are as powerful as this young man who perhaps is entitled, who leaves his father's house, he goes out and he spends everything, lives a dissolute life, and it's only when he reaches the pits of despair that he's willing to turn around and go back to the house of the Father. And something that seems so dramatic, something that seems so, even exaggerated, nevertheless resonates so deeply with our own hearts, because we can each recognize ourselves as that same prodigal son or daughter each time that we turn our backs on God. And so often, perhaps it's precisely a moment of crisis that brings us back. So like the lost son, we have to recognize that we are lost, and then we have to recognize what we receive in the house of the Father. Today we have some of our catechumens with us at Mass, and this is something that they've recognized. Not having received the gift of baptism as babies, as adults, they've made that decision. I want to be a Christian. I want to be Catholic. I want to come into the church. I want to enter into the house of the Father. And I think for each one of us, it's an inspiration to think, how have I left behind the treasures of our Father's house? John Paul II continues, the son who received from the Father the portion of the inheritance that is due to him and leaves home to squander it in a far country in loose living, in a certain sense is the man of every period, beginning with the one who was the first to lose the inheritance of grace and original justice. I don't know about you, but finding a piece of great literature or finding a really good movie, a lot of times what attracts us is that we're able to see ourselves there. That the story that's being told, and there's different characters, and it might be different race, biological sex, all these different things, but we see, I am that person. That story that's being told, there's a truth there that resonates in my own life. And that's the way that we should experience as well this parable of the prodigal son. We are that man. And just like he who was, at the end of his rope, he was feeding pigs, which was probably like the worst job you could have as a Jew. Jesus was presenting something where this person had fallen from any bit of self-respect, but then there's this memory. There's a place where I'm home. There's a place where I'm loved. There's a place where I'm safe. And that's something that we have to remember as well. Perhaps we fall into sin. Perhaps we feel like a failure. Perhaps we're worried about the future. But there's a place where I'm home. And that's precisely where we are right here, and where we're able to be every Sunday that we come together in order to celebrate the Eucharist. I remember growing up, like I think a lot of kids, one of our typical complaints was it's not fair. And my dad, and it was like, my dad was never as predictable as when one of us said it's not fair. Because we would say it's not fair, and my dad would say life's not fair. And for me, I'm very thankful for that, because it's kind of ingrained into my brain. And so, me too. Easily I complain, sometimes to myself, sometimes to others. But whenever it's that aspect of it's not fair, life's not fair. But then there's something else here as well. Because with God, we don't want fair. With God, we want mercy. Because fair, we're in a very bad situation. But because of the love of the Father, because of the love of God, we have something that's so much better than fair. We have mercy. And that's what we're able to see in the parable of the prodigal son. John Paul II says, in the parable of the prodigal son, the term justice is not used even once. Just as in the original text, the term mercy is not used either. Nevertheless, the relationship between justice and love that is manifested as mercy is inscribed with great exactness in the content of the gospel parable. It becomes more evident that love is transformed into mercy when it is necessary to go beyond the price norm of justice, precise and often too narrow. So often we clamor for justice when it's in our favor. But we fail to see the thousands of moments of mercy that we experience. And so this Sunday, as we meditate on the parable of the prodigal son, the parable of the merciful Father, I think God is making an invitation to each one of our hearts to see, how have I experienced God's mercy? How do I need to experience God's mercy? How can I go back to the house of the Father? Because it's not just some great conversion story. Maybe a lot of us, we came from a life of sin. We're trying to live our Catholic lives as best as we can. And that's something that's very real. And it can be a beautiful story. But it is also a story that each one of us is living constantly. because we try and we fail. We come closer to Christ, but then maybe we move away. But he's always waiting for us to come back. And I'd like to make a special invitation to all of the students. This Wednesday we'll have our penance service right here at 8 p.m. And so, if it's been a while since confession, it's a great opportunity. There'll be more priests, not just me and Father Juan Jose, for those who want to be. I really like the video that's on our YouTube this week, a reflection from one of the students about confession, because the way she described confession was going in and telling some random guy your sins, which I thought was an interesting choice of words. But I was thinking I could get a t-shirt and just put random guy, But beyond Father Juan Jose and myself, there'll be a few other random guys available for confession. And so that's a great opportunity. And probably a lot of us ourselves need that. But maybe also we have a friend that we can bring. And maybe reflect a little bit what God's mercy means for you and why you want this friend to experience that as well. So let's continue to live this Mass. Let's continue to live this Lent. So grateful to God for his gift of mercy and doing our best to receive that mercy in the way that he wants to give it to us.